In 23 AD, the fourth year of the Di Huang reign of the Qin dynasty, early summer, July 7th. About 150 kilometers from Luoyang, the small town of Kunyang stood like a solitary island, besieged by an ocean of yellow banners belonging to the Qin army. As far as the eye could see, the land itself had vanished. The encampments of over 100,000 Qin troops were layered one inside another, stretching for tens of kilometers in an unbroken chain. War chariots formed the front line, spears bristled like a forest, and soldiers in armor gripped their weapons. Within the din lurked an oppressive silence that pressed down on everyone from one edge of the horizon to the other. Footsteps, neighing, and the clashing of weapons blended together, grinding heavily across the plains. Kunyang was trapped in the center, looked like a stone about to be swallowed by the waves at any moment. Yet, at this very moment, the focus was not on Kunyang itself. Outside the city, behind the encampment of the great Qin army, on the shore of that yellow sea, a force of 3,000 was drawing up into formation. They were reinforcements for Kunyang. Without banners, without drums or horns, they had silently crossed the river west of Kunyang and arrived at the flank and rear of the Qin headquarters. Wang, the grand realm excellency of the Qin dynasty, sat on horseback on high ground at the center of the army. Wang was one of the three highest-ranking lords of the empire, the most trusted minister of Emperor Wang Mang, and also the emperor's cousin. Beside him was the Grand Civic Excellency, his deputy Wang Shun. 420,000 troops. That was the total strength under his command. Apart from the more than 100,000 already outside Kunyang, soldiers conscripted from provinces were still marching day and night toward this place. And the small town before them? Its walls measured barely 3 kilometers around. Its ramparts were low, and its garrison numbered fewer than 10,000. Wang Yi's true objective was not this small town. The emperor's order was crystal clear: annihilate the main rebel force. That main rebel force was currently besieging Wancheng, south of Kunyang. They had even enthroned a descendant of the Han imperial clan as their leader and explicitly raised the political demand of restoring the Han dynasty. This posed a far greater threat to the empire than the motley bands of bandits or peasants who had risen in revolt elsewhere. Thus, Wang Mang had entrusted the entire military might of the nation to his cousin, demanding that he root out the rebels once and for all. Kunyang was nothing more than a stumbling block, something to be casually crushed on the march. Yet the stubborn garrison of this small city had fought back with desperate tenacity, pinning him down for days. This unexpected vexation gnawed at Wang Yi. Some of his officers advised bypassing Kunyang and advancing directly. But as a scion of the imperial clan, he knew the emperor's temper all too well. He had already been censured once before for failing to pursue another rebel force relentlessly. And this time he dared not repeat such a mistake. But Kunyang had not yet fallen, and now reinforcements, like moths to a flame, had rushed here from elsewhere, totaling around 20,000 men. Wang Yi's scouts had long since detected their movements, and the two sides had already clashed. In one minor skirmish, the Qin cavalry had lost about 1,000 men. 1,000 against 420,000 was negligible, like scooping a ladle of water from the ocean. Annoying like mosquitoes. He resolved to deal with this problem personally. Once this relief force was crushed, Kunyang would fall overnight. Then the entire army would speed south, driving straight for Wancheng, wiping out the rebels' so-called emperor and his rabble in one stroke. Just as he was planning how to attack this relief force, a scout rushed in to report that 3,000 rebels had voluntarily crossed the river to launch an assault. For an instant, Wang Yi did not know whether to be furious or elated. He calmed himself, thought carefully, and then issued his battle orders. Every camp was to hold its position and maintain the encirclement of Kunyang. Without a direct order, no one was to leave their post. As for the 3,000 rebels crossing the river, he would deal with them personally, leading the Central Army's cavalry. The cavalry drew up into formation. Since the era of Emperor Wu, 100 years earlier, heavy cavalry tactics had replaced war chariots as the decisive force on Chinese battlefields. The Xin dynasty, which had usurped Han rule, naturally continued this mode of warfare. The elite horsemen swung into their saddles, their iron armor reflecting a blinding white glare under the scorching sun. Their war horses pawed at the earth nervously and snorted heavy breaths. Preceded by several thousand cavalry, the 10,000-strong main force of the Central Army, like a tide of steel, advanced slowly under the command of Wang Yi and Wang Shun. On the riverbank, 3,000 rebel infantry were drawing up in formation amid the dust. 3,000 against 10,000 cavalry. Infantry against mounted troops. An isolated rebel force with its back to the river, facing an imperial host of 400,000. There was no blare of bugles, no pounding of war drums to urge them on. Only silent ranks shifting in the sultry summer air. Their heavy armor reflected a light entirely different from that of Wang Yi's cavalry, a dull iron gleam. Their colors, too, were unlike the yellow of the Xin forces. They were predominantly red and black, precisely the colors of the Han Empire that Emperor Wang Mang detested most. Wang Yi gave the order, and the cavalry began to deploy. Thousands of horsemen stirred into motion. Hooves broke into a canter, dust billowed skyward, and the earth trembled beneath them. The riders raised their long halberds like a moving forest of steel. The cavalry formations spread out to both wings, covering the entire plain, poised to roll over that formation of 3,000 infantry. But then, in that very moment, the sky changed. A mass of dense cloud boiled up from the southwest, blanketing the heavens with terrifying speed. In the span of a few breaths, daylight plunged into night. Then the rain came down in torrents. It did not simply fall, it smashed down, thick as a waterfall. The topsoil instantly turned to slurry, and in the next second, the slurry turned to ponds. War horses floundered in knee-deep mud, their iron-shod hooves sinking deep into the sodden earth, unable to pull free. Commands were swallowed by the deluge, banners torn apart by the gale. The charging momentum of thousands of cavalry was rendered utterly worthless in the grip of the rainstorm. Horsemen slipped in the mire, fell, and were trampled by their own mounts. The formation scattered, collapsed. The steel tide that Wang Yi had taken such pride in was trapped in a quagmire before it could even launch its charge. The rain poured down in sheets, devouring everything. Yet the infantry across the field did not stop. They drew closer and closer. Wang Yi could finally see them clearly. These were no ordinary 3,000 men. These were 3,000 warriors encased from head to toe in both leather and lamellar armor, double-armored infantry. They trudged through the muck, pushing forward step by step against the torrential rain. Just like Wang Yi's cavalry, their heavy armor became a crippling burden in the rain, ponderous, freezing, suffocating. But not one of them retreated, not one looked back. 3,000 men with no drumbeat, no banner signals, not even a battle cry. They advanced in grim, unstoppable silence, forward, with the calm of those who have already accepted death. Wang Yi clutched his reins so hard his knuckles went white. Rainwater sluiced down the rim of his helmet and poured into his collar. His cavalry was paralyzed in the mud, and his central command was laid bare before this silent army of the dead. A chill, unlike anything he had ever felt, shot up his spine. Who leads them? Who leads them? Who is it over there? His voice was drowned by the rain. An adjutant rushed up and reported a name. Liu Xiu. Wang Yi's expression changed in an instant. Those two words struck him with a shock more profound than the sudden rainstorm or the thunderclaps on the battlefield. Because, as a blood relative of the imperial clan, as the highest-ranking official of the court, as the emperor's most trusted minister, he knew a secret that no one else was privy to. A secret that the empire had scarcely dared to whisper since the day it usurped the Han throne. Among all the prophecies concerning the fate of the empire and the direction of heaven's mandate, there was a mysterious oracle known as the Red Talisman Prophecy. It stated in blunt terms that a man would rise in arms against the illegitimate regime, that forces from the four directions would gather around him like clouds, that they would clash like a struggle of dragons across the vast battlefield, and that, at the crucial cycle of 4-7, the fire virtue would gain the ascendancy. And the prophecy spoke the man's name explicitly, Liu Xiu. 6 years earlier, in 17 AD, dispatch after dispatch flooded into the Weiyang Palace. Under Emperor Wang Mang's absurd rule, the empire, which had been simmering in silence for years, seemed almost overnight to open a Pandora's box of popular uprisings. Everywhere, smoke beacons blazed and the flames of war kindled. Turmoil and rebellion erupted one after another. Among these urgent reports, 2 failed to attract particular attention. One was from the empire's south, where a sudden famine had broken out. A band of starving peasants fled into the green forest hills, gathering several hundred strong, and finally declared an uprising. The empire took no notice. But when provincial troops entered the hills to suppress them, they were routed by these very famine victims. Government granaries were forced open and grain was distributed to the poor. In a short time, recruits surged in like a tidal wave. Within mere months, this band had swelled to tens of thousands. They called themselves the Green Forest Army. Not long after, in the empire's east, in Shandong, which had been stricken by floods from the Yellow River, someone else led famine victims in revolt. These soldiers painted their eyebrows red to identify one another in battle, and they became known as the Red Eyebrow Army. The Green Forest in the south, the Red Eyebrows in the east. These two would ultimately determine the fate of the empire. But at the time, no one knew. In the court at Chang'an, ministers debated endlessly. As Grand Realm Excellency, Wang Yi witnessed the full course of the empire's response. Initially, Emperor Wang Mang threw the empire's military weight against the red eyebrows in the east, because they raised the greatest uproar and were rampant across nearly all the northern provinces. Vast numbers of imperial troops were transferred east for the suppression. This gave the southern Green Forest Army room and time to grow. Years passed, and it was now 23 AD, this very year. The southern Green Forest Army completed a decisive political upgrade. To unify and rally all the rebel forces across the realm, they sought out a descendant of the Liu clan, enthroned him as the new emperor, restored the dynastic title of Han, and adopted the reign name Gengshi. Overnight, the southern half of the empire changed its colors entirely. Wang Mang in Chang'an could no longer sit still. This was no longer a mere revolt of refugees and peasants. It had become a life-or-death struggle for the realm itself. In a sense, the Green Forest Army could no longer even be called a rebel force. They were now the Han Dynasty's army of restoration. The usurper Wang Mang understood that the empire had to concentrate all its power and root them out before they grew any further. Thus, the order flew out with urgency. Conscript crack troops from all regions and assemble at Luoyang by the deadline. This grand army, to be led by Grand Realm Excellency Wang Yi and Grand Civic Excellency Wang Shun, was charged with crushing the Han restoration forces with the overwhelming force of a mountain bearing down. Historical sources give various figures for the exact number of this army. But from the standpoints of authority and plausibility, Chinese historians tend to accept the number 420,000. And this figure is not even the total of all mobilized men. It refers specifically to the armored soldiers, meaning the combat personnel in armor. If logistics personnel were included, the total likely reached the 1 million that the Qin dynasty publicly claimed. It is worth noting that the intended battlefield was only 300 kilometers from the empire's heartland, the Guangdong region, and less than 200 kilometers from the secondary capital of Luoyang. The area had been a well-developed, grain-producing region with excellent transport links since ancient times. There were none of the immense difficulties associated with projecting power and organizing supply lines to distant frontiers. Therefore, whether considering the necessity of the empire's survival or the feasibility of logistics, an army of 420,000 was, at that moment, a realistically plausible number. It must also be pointed out, of course, that the 420,000-strong army did not all mass at Luoyang and then set out in one body. That was the total number of troops conscripted from across the empire. Due to varying distances, they inevitably arrived at the battlefield at different times. Indeed, Chinese historical records do note this. Based on the deductions of military and historical scholars, on the day of the decisive battle, the Qin dynasty's total strength on the Kunyang field was likely around 200,000, with a vast number of troops still in the process of marching to the front. Yet even 200,000 was a staggering figure. What's more, this was no ordinary army. To guarantee absolute success, Emperor Wang Mang had summoned 63 masters of military strategy from across the nation to serve as generals and staff officers in the various camps. Perhaps to boost morale, or because of Wang Mang's own taste for the theatrical, the army also included a giant from the Penglai region. He stood 1 jiang tall, roughly 2.3 meters, and measured 10 spans around the waist, a figure so immense it stupefied all who saw him. It is said his name was Juwuba, and to this day that name remains the most common Chinese term to describe a colossal person or thing. Initially, this giant had been recommended to Wang Mang for use against the Xiongnu. But Wang Mang intensely disliked his name. Wang Mang's own courtesy name was Zhu Jun, and Zhu Wuba sounded ominously like Zhu Jun cannot dominate. For this reason, Wang Mang had never put this giant, taller even than Yao Ming, to significant use. Yet on the eve of the Empire's decisive battle, the Emperor granted the giant the rank of colonel, ordering him to march with the army and supervise the construction of fortifications. Not only that, but Wang Mang, ever fond of collecting rare beasts, also commandeered all the fierce animals from the imperial hunting parks. Tigers, leopards, rhinoceroses and elephants were herded in groups and incorporated into the army's order of march. Their roars meant to overawe the enemy. Tigers and leopards cleared the path. Rhinoceroses and elephants shook the earth. Such was the origin and the full picture of the army under Wang Yi's command. In a sense, it was not merely a vast military host. It was the ultimate embodiment of the Xin dynasty and of Wang Mang's personal will and whims. This army was the Xin Empire itself. At first, the imperial army marching south from Luoyang had only its vanguard of 50,000 or 60,000 men arrive north of Kunyang. But it was already a spectacle of banners obscuring the sky and dust blotting out the sun. The two chief commanders of the garrison, upon seeing the imperial host approach, they immediately fled back inside the walls. Panic began to spread through Kunyang. The officers gathered privately. Some lamented that the city was too small, its walls too low, and that 8,000 men holding out here was just waiting to die. They even began to discuss dispersing with their own troops before the encirclement closed, each heading back to his own territory. Nobody spoke of mounting a defense, because that sounded like a joke. At this moment, a young man of only 28 stepped forward. His rank was merely that of a junior general, but when he spoke, there was neither panic nor empty rhetoric. He laid the facts on the table. If they scattered and fled now, outside the city there would be open ground, no walls, no cover. The enemy cavalry could run them down within a couple of hours. None of you, he said, would be able to protect your families or your possessions, and every one of you would be overtaken and killed. On the other hand, if they concentrated their forces and held Kunyang, despite the extreme peril, they could at least rely on the walls to tie down the main enemy force and wait for relief troops from other cities to come to the rescue. Two choices. Make your own call. The assembled officers were stunned for a moment, and then some faces flushed crimson. A junior general daring to lecture them on warfare? Some sneered, some slapped the table. Indignant shouts rose in the room. But before the argument could reach a conclusion, the scout they had sent out stumbled back in. He reported that the main enemy force had already reached the north of the city, their battle lines stretching to the horizon with no end in sight. The drums outside rumbled like thunder. The room suddenly went silent. Fear sobered them. No, it utterly unnerved them. Every eye turned to that young junior general. His name was Liu Xiu. This time no one dared to contradict him. He was their one and only lifeline. Kunyang finally resolved to fight to the death. Outside the city, the fresh Xin troops continued to press forward in an endless stream. The force that first reached the walls already numbered close to 100,000. Reinforcements from Yingchuan marched day and night. Camp after camp was pitched, merging into one black plain. Cloud ladders, wooden siege towers over 30 meters high, were pushed to the front. They stood taller than Kunyang's walls, and enemy crossbowmen on them could look down upon every head on the battlements. During the day, when drums sounded, the towers slowly trundled toward the walls, and arrows rained down on the defenders like a deluge. The garrison could only huddle behind the crenellations with their shields raised. The defenders inside the city grew hungrier and thirstier. The water sources had long been sealed off. Shin cavalry patrolled the riverbank, and anyone venturing out to fetch water was shot into a pincushion. Someone devised a solution: to go out carrying a wooden door plank as a shield. Several men hefted thick door planks onto their backs and bent double shuffled step by step toward the water. Arrows thudded into the wood with a sickening sound. When they dragged the water buckets back, the planks bristled with arrows, exactly like hedgehogs. In this desperate hour, Liu Xiu made a decision: to break out and seek reinforcements. Liu Xiu volunteered personally, taking only 12 other men. Under cover of darkness, they charged out of the gates of Kunyang. Outside, the Shin camps were everywhere. The vanguard had already encircled Kunyang in 3 layers. Watchfires burned between the tents, and patrols of cavalry roamed the darkness with raised spears. The hooves of the 13 horses padded over the dry earth, the sound mostly swallowed by the night wind. They moved through the shadows between the tents, skirted wagon after wagon of supplies, and slipped through the gaps when patrols changed shifts. As they approached the outermost fringe of the Shin encampment, Liu Xiu and his 12 riders suddenly broke into a gallop. By the time the sentries reacted and the shouting and gongs exploded, the 13 riders had already dashed through the last defensive line and vanished into the darkness. The escape was so nearly miraculous that the history books simply state, they barely made it out. After fighting his way out of Kunyang, Liu Xiu rode east to seek aid from the garrisons of 2 other cities. He explained the dire situation in Kunyang and demanded that they abandon their own cities and bring their entire forces back with him to the rescue. To return and relieve Kunyang meant marching out from their own as yet unthreatened camps and plunging directly into a siege ring of over 400,000, voluntarily throwing themselves in front of the enemy's main force. Anyone would hesitate in such a situation. What was more, after capturing several cities in succession, their camps were piled high with plundered grain, cloth and weapons. Some were loath to abandon these newly acquired spoils. Others feared that once they gave up the cities, they would have nothing left. A few privately proposed a compromise: leave half the troops to hold the cities and take the other half to the rescue. In their view, that would at least preserve the assets they had already seized. After hearing these words, Liu Xiu did not grow angry. Instead, he cut straight to the heart of the matter. If we fight and win this battle, crushing the enemy, the treasures and riches will be 10,000 times more than what we have now. If we lose this battle, you won't even keep your heads. What good will those possessions be then? It was as simple as that. This plain logic sliced through the complexities of reality. The outside commanders brought out every soldier from their camps, roughly 20,000 men in all, abandoned their cities and followed Liu Xiu west, marching straight for Kunyang. Liu Xiu placed himself at the very front of the column. He drew off over 1,000 cavalry as an advance guard, riding at their head with the main body of the army following close behind. When this vanguard reached a point about 3 kilometers from the enemy's main camp, Liu Xiu ordered them to halt and form up on the spot. Mang's army quickly detected this force approaching from the east. Orders came down from the lines, dispatching several thousand men to engage them. In their eyes, a vanguard of a mere 1,000 or so riders was not worth making a fuss about. Sending a few thousand would suffice. The historical records state that once the two forces clashed, Liu Xiu was the first to charge. He personally spurred his horse into the enemy ranks and fought hand to hand, cutting down dozens of men in rapid succession. Watching this, the outside commanders uttered a remark so striking that it was recorded in the histories. General Liu is usually cautious and hesitant when facing a small enemy detachment. Today, confronted with the enemy's main force, he charges at the very front. It truly beggars belief. Equally unbelievable was the result of the fighting. Under Liu Xiu's personal leadership, that force of just over 1,000 Han soldiers actually repelled the attack of several thousand Shin troops. The other Han commanders came to their senses and began pressing forward with their respective units. Liu Xiu continued to advance, and the main relief force swept in behind him. In this clash, they killed several hundred of the enemy. The numbers were not huge, but the impact on morale was enormous. Meanwhile, Liu Xiu did one more thing. He sent a messenger toward Kunyang with a military dispatch, claiming that Wang Cheng had already fallen to the Han army. It was not true, but it did not have to be true. The stratagem worked. This false report not only entered Kunyang and boosted Han morale, but also reached the enemy's main camp. From high-ranking generals down to common soldiers, the Shin forces began to grasp the implication. If Wang Cheng had truly fallen, then the main Han army had freed its hands and could bear down on Kunyang from the south at any time. In that case, their 420,000 men outside Kunyang would no longer be the hunters. They would be a force caught between the walls of Kunyang and the approaching external army. Morale does not erode all at once, but once it starts, it has already begun to shift. Liu Xiu chose not to slow his pace. From the 20,000 men of the relief force, he picked 3,000 of the strongest and bravest. These 3,000 were the elite, a forlorn hope, the hidden dagger that would decide victory or defeat. The histories record that Liu Xiu's 3,000 crossed the river west of the city and launched a sudden assault. The Shin commanders Wang Yi and Wang Shun, caught between anxiety over the main Han force at Wancheng and contempt for this mere 3,000, issued an extraordinary command. Every camp was to remain in place. No one was permitted to sortie without orders. The two commanders would personally lead the central army into battle. From a strictly military standpoint, the order had its logic. The movements of the Han main force at Wancheng were unknown, and thousands of enemies still remained inside Kunyang. With hundreds of thousands of men camped outside the city, hundreds of separate encampments, and battle lines stretching tens of kilometers, if every camp rushed out the moment it spotted the enemy, the army's coordination would descend into chaos. What they failed to account for, however, was Liu Xiu's combat prowess. And then the sudden rainstorm bogged Wang Yi's heavy cavalry down in the mud. The weather seemed to have come to the Han army's considerable aid. But up to this point, the Shin soldiers in the front ranks had not been rattled. They had the advantage of numbers, a well-ordered formation, their commanders holding the line behind them, and over 400,000 troops at their backs. They thought this was just a minor skirmish that would end quickly. Only when the Han soldiers crashed into them did they realize something was terribly wrong. The Han soldiers kept surging forward, moving too fast, their eyes carrying something different from ordinary troops. It was not the look of men seeking to survive. It was the resolve of men who had staked their lives on a single blow. The first line collided. The impact of shields, the hacking of blades, and screams erupted all at once. The Han troops did not stop on the line of contact. They smashed directly into the formation. The 3,000 were swallowed by the Shin square, but they were not drowned. They kept pushing forward. Men in the front hacked and killed, while those behind pushed the front ranks onward. The whole force was like a spring compressed to its limit, pressing inch by inch toward the direction of the Shin's central command. The battle line began to warp. The Shin soldiers in front were forced step by step backward. Those behind, shoved by the retreating men, could not keep their footing. The formation grew so tightly packed that there was no room to swing a spear. Sword and shield men were squeezed together, unable to move. A formation of over 10,000 men was being caved in from the front by a force of 3,000. Standing behind the lines, Wang Yi began to suspect he might have underestimated this unit. And most crucially, the secret that the Empire had treated as its highest classified intelligence echoed relentlessly in the depths of his mind. Liu Xiu? Liu Xiu? Could this be that Liu Xiu? On the walls of Kunyang, the defenders saw movement in the distant Shin battle lines. They had been besieged for so many days, the enemy formation outside had always stood like an immovable wall. But now a breach had appeared in that wall. The senior commanders inside the city did not dare to sally forth recklessly, but every eye on the ramparts was fixed on that crack. For the first time in all these days of siege, they saw the enemy fall back, even if it was just a gap. Liu Xiu did not stop. The 3,000 death defiers continued to grind into the formation, blades, shield edges, and spear points churning in the confined space. He led his elite troops into the throng, cut one man down, pulled his sword free, cut another down, without pausing for breath from start to finish. Seeing their commander fighting at the very front, none of his men dared to lag behind. The 3,000 clambered over the bodies of fallen foes and kept surging forward. Wang Yi's lines compressed tighter and grew more chaotic. The soldiers in the front began to break. Some threw down their shields and ran back. Their legs trembled, and one soldier's terror was contagious. One man fleeing would sweep a whole group with him. The Han troops had already hacked through the first line. The central command lay straight ahead. And because Wang Yi had previously ordered the other camps to make no rash moves, the soldiers in those surrounding encampments simply stood in place, watching the line around the center waver, banners topple, and the shouts of slaughter draw nearer. They had no idea what was happening, only that something had gone terribly wrong at the center. Some wanted to rush to help, but waited for an order that never came. Others had already started moving, but the camp gates had not been opened. No one dared to sortie without authorization. It was the Commander-in-Chief's direct order. Hundreds of thousands of men were frozen by a single command. And then Wang Shun died. According to the historical records, when the Han troops surged near the central command, in the chaos of the melee, the enemy's deputy commander, the Shin dynasty's Grand Civic Excellency Wang Shun, was cut down. The soldiers around him saw Wang Shun's banner fall, saw his bodyguards scatter, saw horsemen racing out from that direction with pale faces, shouting something unintelligible. The battle line fractured in that very instant. The Xin soldiers in the front had still been resisting when they suddenly realized that men behind them were fleeing. When they turned to look back, the direction of the central command was already a scene of utter chaos. No one told them what to do next. The officers themselves were searching for orders, but no orders would come. At the very moment the Xin central force began to lose control, the south gate of Kunyang suddenly flew open. The garrison surged out. They saw the Xin battle line wavering, the commander's standard toppling. This time they did not hesitate. Drums beat, war cries erupted, and every man in the city poured out. Under the pouring rain, the pincer attack from inside and outside Kunyang was launched simultaneously. The Xin central force was crushed from both east and west. Total collapse was now inevitable. Wang Yi, protected by a remnant of his guard, barely managed to retreat to his encampment. But the siege ring had been torn open. The encirclement of Kunyang was breached. And it was at this moment that the celestial signs on the battlefield shifted again. Above the other Xin camps, not yet reached by the storm, a mass of dark cloud accumulated, pressing down from the sky like a collapsing mountain. It plunged straight toward the Xin army's main encampment, halting barely 30 centimeters above the ground before bursting apart with a roar. The historical records state that every officer and soldier was so terrified they threw themselves flat on the ground, not daring to look up. This was no ordinary cloud. It was as if a tiny piece of the sky had fallen. Lying on the ground, the soldiers' minds could no longer even process tactics. Even more calamitous, that very night, a meteor fell into the Xin camp. Not the kind that streaks across the sky and vanishes, a solid, physical impact. A ball of fire descended from above and slammed into an open space between the tents. The earth shook, and the tremendous crash reverberated across the entire encampment. Soldiers burst from their tents to see the blaze and hear the thunderous noise. Some among the tents fell to their knees. Others flattened themselves to the ground, too terrified to move. Still others began to weep and wail. The Xin soldiers' loyalty to Wang Mang's regime had never been indestructible. The Han Dynasty, a regime barely over a decade old, had been sustained by draconian laws and a colossal military machine. When you stand on a battlefield, see the enemy kill your commander-in-chief, and then witness something fall from the heavens and smash into your camp, you understand in your gut, this battle is still going on. But something seems to have gone wrong with Wang Mang's mandate of heaven. The previous day's chaos had not yet subsided. Word of Wang Shun's death was still spreading through the camp. The Kunyang garrison had broken out. Liu Xiu's relief force was still attacking. And now the heavens were disgorging these portents. They could be natural phenomena, battlefield coincidences, but no one in that camp saw them as separate. All the terror was fused into a single conviction. The mandate of heaven had changed. The wild beasts, it seemed, grasped the dread power of nature and the heavens even more acutely than men. The tigers, leopards, rhinoceroses and elephants, herded and guarded by the giant Juwuba, were originally meant to overawe the battlefield. When all went well, the roars of tigers and leopards truly could terrify the foe. But now everything was out of control. The storm had hit. Thunder cracked, lightning split the sky, and rain lashed against the cages like whips. Tigers and leopards began to hurl themselves madly around their iron cages, slamming against the bars. Iron chains clanked and strained. Rhinoceroses smashed their wooden pens to splinters with their horns. Elephants kicked over their transport carts. Iron chains snapped, and the cages were burst open. Juwuba tried to regain control, but his commands were swallowed by the thunder, and the enraged beasts paid him no heed. The animals burst from their cages, but they did not charge the Han troops. They charged the nearest humans, their own army. Tigers and leopards lunged into the crowds. Elephants trampled tents and supply wagons flat. Rhinoceroses rampaged unchecked through the camp. Screams filled the air. Not the screams of men being cut down by the enemy, but the screams of men being mauled, torn, and trampled by wild beasts. The chaos at this point reached a point beyond all remedy. Men could run, but the beasts could chase. Hundreds of thousands of men trampled each other within the confined camp. More terrifying than the enemy was fear itself. And so the rout began. The Shin army's rout spiraled from chaos into pure catastrophe. Soldiers threw away their weapons, their shields, their armor, and fled south, discarding anything that might slow them down. The river south of Kunyang seemed the only escape route, but the torrential rain had already flooded it. The water level had risen many times above normal, the current swift and turbid. Those who could not swim were swept away the instant they jumped in. Even those who could swim could not withstand the force of the flood. The corpses multiplied, some floating on the surface, some sinking to the bottom, piling higher and higher until they clogged the entire river. The histories record that the drowned Shin soldiers numbered in the tens of thousands, their bodies so densely amassed that the river's current was dammed to a standstill. The empire's Grand Realm Excellency Wang abandoned his army and fled for his life across the river with a handful of light cavalry. The battlefield was left strewn with corpses, weapons, chariots, horses and provisions, all mixed in the mud. The spoils and baggage were so ubiquitous that the Han army carried them off for a long time and still could not remove them all. As for those tigers, leopards, rhinoceroses and elephants, some died on the battlefield, some scattered into the wilderness, and some were hunted down and killed. The figure of Juwuba vanished from the pages of the historical records. Whether he was killed by the Han army or perished in the flood, no one knows. The encirclement outside Kunyang disintegrated entirely. Just days before, this had been the camp of several 100,000 imperial troops, blanketing the fields for several hundred kilometers, where siege towers stared down upon the walls, banners blotted out the sun, and the sound of drums traveled for several hundred kilometers. And everything came to an end in a battle so saturated with signs and wonders. It was a psychological war, a meteorological war, and a war of the mandate of heaven, all collapsing together in a single moment. The finest, most elite field army of the Shin dynasty was utterly destroyed outside Kunyang by a sudden cataclysm of nature. Wang Mang's mandate of heaven shattered into powder, just like the collapsing cloud that burst 30 centimeters above the earth. The Battle of Kunyang concluded in total victory for the Han army. Through this battle, Liu Xiu was transformed from an obscure junior general into a commander celebrated across the realm. And the prophecy that Wang Mang and his new empire had guarded as their highest secret began quietly to spread.